Welcome to a presentation titled Toward Open Pragmatism, Developing a Revised Framework for Openness. My name is Eric Christiansen, and I'm an assistant professor librarian at Mount Royal University in Calgary, Canada.
And my name is Michael McNally, and I'm an associate professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada.
Now, before we get into the details of this study, we want to give a bit of a background of our previous work. In 2019, we both published a paper in First Monday titled Open Enough: 8 Factors to Consider When Transitioning from Closed to Open Resources and Courses. And it was in this paper that we wanted to explore, through a thought experiment, the possibility of creating a conceptual framework that would help educators who are interested in either developing their own open course or adapting an existing open course, and wanted to help educators better evaluate what was out there. Using the literature from the OER universe as well as our own experience, we developed 8 factors which we felt best represented all of the components of OER and OpenCourseWare. So these factors included copyright and open licensing frameworks, accessibility and usability formatting, language, support cost, assessment, digital distribution, file format, and cultural considerations. In this paper, we created a variety of scales. And what we did is that we examined each of these 8 factors under 3 hypothetical scenarios: being closed, meaning that they are not at all optimized for open education; mixed, these would be aspects of the course, these factors that were somewhat open; and then, of course, most open. And we described each of these factors and how they would be expressed under these different scenarios. The paper also walked educators through a flow chart of how to address these elements through their project. So the first step was choosing which elements actually needed to be addressed for an OpenCourseWare or OER project. The second step was examining the effort and willingness required to implement each of these. And we separated effort and willingness deliberately. For example, choosing a more open license requires more willingness because the educator is giving away more of their rights. So we divided those into separate scales. We also examined the skill and knowledge required to implement each of these 8 factors from a closed to most open scenario.
So this table summarizes our categorization across the 8 factors. And as opposed to categorizing the factors simply as open or closed as a dyad, we've used a spectrum approach and roughed out roughly 3 positions for each one of the factors. So for example, with copyright and open licensing, in the closed position is the traditional all rights reserved. The most open side would be a CC BY license or the public domain mark. And in the middle would be some of the more restrictive open licenses. And what we did in the paper was not only sketched out these spectrums for each of the factors, as Eric noted, but we also examined effort and willingness and came to some interesting results and findings about different cases where there's perhaps defaultness involved, where instructors have to choose closedness, and as well identified some factors such as language and cultural considerations, which tended to be quite intensive for effort, skill, and willingness in terms of heading towards the most open approach. So of course, discussing factors of openness is not unique to our approach, and our work has been informed by a couple of different bodies of literature. The first being the growing body of work examining different ways of conceiving of openness. And of course, one of the most notable studies in this area is Pomerantz and Peek's 2016 piece, 50 Shades of Open, where they look at over 50 different open types of content, everything from open source software, open educational resources, all the way to some less well-known examples like open source seeds or open source beer. And they look at what are the different ways in which the idea of openness is being used. And they identify several different ways that openness is being used, and also highlight the dangers of open washing as well. There are many different approaches to openness. Highlighting some of them here is Hodgkinson, Williams, and Gary's 4-facet spectrum of openness. And so much like our approach, they use a similar spectrum, but this time across just 4 facets: social, technical, legal, and financial. Peter and Diamond have an interesting approach, not looking at openness necessarily at a single point in time, but over the course of history, and noting the role of openness contracting and expanding at various points throughout history. Economides and Pirifanu talk about 11 approaches to openness in their topology, and Cronin, in her doctoral dissertation, looks at 4 different facets: admission, free, OER, and OEP. And this is by no means an exhaustive list, but some of the more developed and interesting approaches. In terms of actually evaluating openness, the literature is much more limited. The most notable framework is the ALMS framework, with ALMS standing for access to editing tools, level of expertise, meaningfully editable, and source file access, that was developed by Hinton and al. In 2010. Notably, Gorell's doctoral dissertation in 2012 takes this framework and tries to evaluate it using creating a scoring rubric, and that's similar to the work that we'll be talking about today. Abe Wardina's work looks at creating a desirability index, but by and large, there's very few frameworks for open education that consider openness as opposed to quality, for example.
So an important question entering into the study is, why develop a framework at all? And we feel that there's a couple key reasons why developing a framework is necessary. The first is that it's really important that we better understand the state of OpenCourseWare and OER. These platforms continue to evolve over time as more and more educators add their content to the World Wide Web and make it available to everybody. So by creating a framework where we can meaningfully evaluate OER, we can decide where we can improve in the OER and OpenCourseWare environment and get an idea of what we're already doing well. Because as we will see through this study, even though this is a very small pilot with a limited sample size, there are some things that were done very well among the OpenCourseWare sample. The second is that the context and broader utility of these resources isn't always clear. And this can sometimes be addressed by additional or ancillary resources that an educator uploads alongside a learning object or OpenCourseWare. Now, the third reason is that we want to give educators a more robust guide for developing new or adapting existing OpenCourseWare and OER. Currently, as we said in our literature review, the frameworks for evaluating existing OER or prioritizing time when developing one from scratch are limited. And our hope is that these frameworks will give a better foundation for educators who are new to open education to develop their resources. Moving on to this study, we had 2 research questions that we wanted to address. The first is, are these factors in the framework robust enough to analyze or measure the level of openness in OpenCourseWare? So the primary factor that we looked at in this study was to really test the framework to see if it was robust for future analysis. The second research question is, are certain factors impractical for measurement, and do some factors require modification or expansion?
So turning then to our approach, we decided to look at OpenCourseWare in both this project and the previous one, in part because OpenCourseWare has more elements than does regular open educational resources. And we felt that developing a framework and evaluating that framework with respect to courses was perhaps a better approach because it could be more easily applied to open educational resources. We went to the OpenCourseWare Consortium website for OpenCourseWare listings. Of the 16 repositories listed, we selected 2 TU Delft and MIT's OpenCourseWare portals. This was in part because these were amongst the very few currently offered OpenCourseWare initiatives that focused in a post-secondary context. After identifying the TU Delft and MIT OCW portals, we then pulled out a list of current courses. And so in MIT's case, this was 38 courses that were offered in the past 5 years. And TU Delft had over 200, but once we removed MOOCs, it was down to 116 courses. And we randomly selected 5 from each of the 2 institutions. And then we set upon evaluating the courses. So we looked at 8 factors for each of the 10 courses, and both Eric and I were involved in the evaluation. And now we'd like to discuss some of the results.
This slide gives a high-level overview of the results from the courses analyzed. So along the left-hand side, you can see the courses that we analyzed from both MIT and TU Delft. And across the top, we have each of the factors that we looked at for every single course. Now, one thing that's important to note is that evaluating all of these factors for every single course was quite time consuming. And this was a reason why we stuck to the evaluation of 5 courses per institution. Each of us independently evaluated the OpenCourseWare sample and then later came together to reconcile our results and kind of go back and revisit areas that were difficult to agree on or that were unclear in our first pass. From a high level, there's a few things that are apparent. You'll notice that copyright and open licensing frameworks were all mixed, and this is largely due to the fact that institutions like TU Delft and MIT impose a standardized license. However, other factors are more split. For instance, accessibility was very open among MIT courses and very closed among TU Delft, and we'll talk about those in more detail in the further slides. Language was overwhelmingly closed, as well as support costs, with some exceptions for both MIT and TU Delft. Assessment was mixed, but was relatively open, given that the majority of courses provided assignments and outlines for those assignments, so instructors, in theory, could adapt them to their own course. A great success of this analysis was that we found that digital distribution, or the findability of these courses through the major OER repositories, was very open. Now, this is not totally surprising, given that these large institutions are better able to market their courses than perhaps smaller institutions, but given that openness and discoverability has been a lingering problem, we thought this was a huge success. Most surprising was the closedness of file format, given that the vast majority of materials were uneditable. And when it came to cultural considerations, it was also a bit of a mixed bag. Some courses, particularly those from the STEM fields from MIT, but predominantly TU Delft, were very open because they had little in terms of cultural specificity, where other courses that were more rooted in the social sciences and humanities were more culturally specific and therefore were unsurprisingly more closed in their nature. We'll talk a little bit more about the challenges around cultural considerations later.
So with regard to examining the framework and the question of did it work? Yes, by and large, with some important caveats. As we'll discuss, some of the factors were very difficult to examine and in many ways quite subjective. So cultural considerations in particular, it was very difficult to determine, is this mixed or most open, even from using our own framework. Usability was also another challenge in that while we were able to assess accessibility, usability considerations would have required much more work, and as such, you'll see in our revised framework, we've decided to put these as other considerations. As well, we also found that rewording some of the factors helps simplify and make the framework easier to understand. So digital distribution will be retermed discoverability. As noted, accessibility / usability just becomes accessibility. And support costs really more accurately can be described as materials. So now we'll walk through each of the factors.
So the first slide of results is copyright and open licensing frameworks. And as I said previously, all of the courses analyzed fell under mixed. Now, this isn't totally surprising, and this result may be different had there been a larger sample of courses, but both MIT and TU Delft employ the same somewhat restrictive Creative Commons license, which is a CC BY non-commercial share alike. There are some downsides to this license because it is difficult under these licensing terms for an educator to take aspects of this course and combine it with another. Overall, this is still more open than an all rights reserved course. Under different circumstances, categorizing the openness of OpenCourseWare or OER would be slightly more challenging. So for instance, how would a course be classified if all the documents of an open course adhered to different licensing terms? This is something that should be explored in a future study.
With regards to accessibility, MIT scored well across the board on all of its courses, and this reflects MIT's well-established policies for accessibility, and also this extends to several other factors as well. In particular, MIT explicitly notes that it's committed to the WC3 WCAG 2.0 standard, as well as it makes available many different elements to support accessibility. So there are not only transcripts for videos, there are actually interactive transcripts for videos where you can search and find and play certain specific elements. TU Delft did not have the same institutional level of commitment and was more mixed. We did find closed captioning for some videos, but without transcripts to download. And more broadly, with relationship to usability, while we were able to relatively easily access accessibility for each course, usability was a far more complicated piece of the overall project, and we would have required effectively an individual study to look at each single course, or at least each portal, to determine how usable they were. So we've removed that from the framework based on our findings.
In terms of language, the majority of these courses fell under the closed category. All of the courses were predominantly offered in English, even TU Delft, which is a Dutch institution. There were some notable exceptions, which include TU Delft's Drinking Water Treatment 2. This course provided a final report example and some assignment examples in Dutch. So there was a little bit more nuance in terms of language, but the majority of these courses were one language, English. And this is not really surprising, given that the work to translate OpenCourseWare and make it available in multiple languages would probably require funding or specialized knowledge or language skills on behalf of the educator. So while these courses were closed, this was somewhat expected from the outset.
With regards to support costs or materials, this was a rather disappointing area that we found in our study. Most of the courses scored as either mixed or closed, with only one being most open, and that course was a TU Delft course that had a custom-built textbook that was available on an open access basis. In many cases, courses relied on links to Amazon to make materials available. So on the left-hand side, there's an image from MIT. This is from the Equity and Inclusion course. And as you can see, there's a number of buy at Amazon links. Even more importantly, perhaps it's worth noting the fourth resource there, the Martin Luther King letter that they're advertising to buy from Amazon, is actually freely available on the web. So in some cases, the courses were significantly less open than they could be.
In terms of assessment, we categorized all of the courses as mixed, with some exceptions. So overall, qualitative assessments were provided, sometimes with examples of student work. So these were mixed because the assessments were provided both as a high-level outline in the syllabus, as well there was a assignment description somewhere in the course package. The natural sciences courses had much more emphasis on quantitative assessments, again, which is not surprising. And these often had assessments and solutions available. So if you look at the image on the left-hand side, this is from the TU Delft course, Hydrology of Catchment Rivers and Deltas. And this is a screenshot where there is answers to a quantitative assignment provided. So we think that there is probably forever going to be an advantage in terms of STEM courses, so the natural sciences and engineering, in terms of their ability to provide both questions and answers, because qualitative assessments would require, at best, examples of student work, because there's not one set answer. We feel that as a result of this analysis and looking at this sample of OpenCourseWare, that the assessment factor appears to be relatively easy to make open, at least in the mixed format.
Digital distribution was a real success story in terms of all of the courses scored the most open finding in the analysis. Not only were we able to find courses through the OpenCourseWare portal, that was how we initially determined where we would begin our study, but major search portals such as Oasis or the OER Commons would have results available. So for example, on the lower left-hand side, there's a search in Oasis for structured electronic design, and it's restricted to courses. And of course, the TU Delft course that we studied in this case comes up very easily. And this is an important finding because historically, concerns around discoverability or findability have been punctuated in the OER and OCW literature. And this demonstrates that certainly for major OCW platforms like TU Delft and MIT, discoverability is not a concern.
In contrast, the file format factor was both the most surprising and most disappointing among this analysis. The vast majority of the courses were categorized as closed because most assignments, assessments, and other course materials were almost exclusively provided in a non-editable PDF format. And the closed nature is the most surprising given how easy it is to upload multiple file formats to a given platform. In our previous paper, we noted that the skill and effort required to provide course materials in more than one editable format was fairly low. So we didn't really understand why these courses didn't provide this to educators, given that the assumption would be that these materials could be used or adapted for other courses at institutions. In terms of video, there are still questions about how to measure the openness, and this would also apply for audio. So for many of these courses, transcripts are usually available as a separate file for videos, which is great, meaning that somebody could read a full transcript, much like an interview, and get an idea of the lecture or the guest speaker or whatever was brought into the course. However, there is some question about what is a more or less editable video file format. And this is something that we speculated about on our previous paper and still don't have a defined answer. Is a open or most open video file format just a commonly accepted video file like MP4 or AAC or MKV, or does it actually have to provide the educator with the raw files rather than the more polished output that's presented in this course? This is something we're still struggling with at this time. There's also some question about harvestability, which we'll talk about later, in terms of the ability to download the entire portion of a course, including the video files.
Cultural considerations was a rather challenging factor to address. In many cases, the more technical and scientific courses tended to be more open, and this is in part because they were free of general cultural references. In other cases, it became very challenging to determine whether a course was mixed, open, or closed based on some of the references they use. So for example, in the upper left-hand slide, this is the public transportation course from MIT. It uses examples from around the world, including this is a discussion of the Mumbai transit system. But that led to some challenges for Eric and I to determine, is this most open because they've made reference to examples from around the world, or is it only partially open and the mixed category because you'd still need to be familiar with the transit system? As well, on the lower left-hand side, for example, there's a classification of life discussion from the public hygiene course at TU Delft, and it makes reference to the Bible and the classification of life that's in there. And again, this was another point where how open or closed is this, given the, to some degree, well-knownness of the Bible and its amongst many people on earth, but at the same time, it is a cultural reference. And so ultimately, we decided that this factor is simply just too subjective to be evaluated along this spectrum, and we've decided to move it in our revised framework that we'll now highlight.
So as you can see on the right, we have provided a revised version of the framework. Now, this framework looks somewhat different from the one that we proposed in our previous paper. We have changed digital distribution to discoverability. We think that language is more clear to educators on the outside. Usability and cultural considerations were both moved to the other considerations section. While these are too subjective to evaluate on a closed, mixed, and most open analysis, they are still things that an educator would want to consider. So we've included them in other because they're still important. And we've also noted that we can divide these factors into two large buckets. There are technical factors, and those are more associated with the nuts and bolts or technology-related aspects to getting a course online, making it discoverable, the types of materials and the formats that are provided. However, the pedagogical factors, which we think are probably more difficult to assess for an educator, are those like language, materials assessment, and accessibility. So we've now divided our framework into essentially two OpenCourseWare OER domains.
Our study still has us pondering several lingering questions, and the first one is to which degree we should consider harvestability, or the ability to collect easily all of the materials for a course in a single click or at a single spot, as a potential factor. MIT made very good use of this kind of download course materials button where you could download almost all of the materials of the course except for video files. TU Delft, on the other hand, would require you to manually download each individual piece. And we continue to ponder how we might integrate the questions around harvestability as a perhaps other consideration in the framework.
There are also some lingering questions regarding the openness of video, which we alluded to earlier. So openness of video or audio formats is still an open question. Should file format address just the type of format provided? So common formats that would be highly editable using a variety of paid and free video editors would include MP4, MP3, MKV, MOV, AAC, etc. Or should this factor also take into account the editability of raw unedited footage? Many of these courses provide the ability to download lectures, which in theory could be edited and recompiled by another educator. But the raw unedited video file formats are not there, meaning that the output that's available to an external educator is a much more polished format in many cases. So we don't have a solution as of yet other to how we would evaluate video outside of the availability of the file format type, but it should be noted that considering how editable the actual file is something that faculty who are interested in adapting a course should take into consideration.
One last lingering question had to do with the volume of content. So again, this framework is a framework for measuring openness, not the quality of resources. And one of the things we discovered is that in some cases, the volume of content was significantly different among various courses. Some courses you would have huge amounts of detailed lectures and videos and notes. And in the case of the Introduction to Art History course, which is pictured here on the right-hand side, there was a list of paintings that would be discussed, but no indication of what about those paintings was discussed. And so we noticed that openness actually has no clear, strong relationship to the content level or the quality of content. And this is certainly something to think about going forward, is what is the relationship between the educational quality of a resource, the volume of content in a resource, and the openness of the resources or resources themselves.
So some broader conclusions that we came to in the study are as follows. As we said earlier, we feel that the framework, particularly in its revised form, is an effective way for assessing OpenCourseWare and OER. However, even based on this small sample size, we do feel that there are some critical things that could be done to improve OER, and many of them don't require an enormous amount of effort. In this slide, we have color-coded where we feel emphasis should be placed. Check marks in green being that we're already doing very well with those factors. White caution markers showing places where we can improve, but there are still some advances in openness already. And then the red X's are places where focus needs to be provided moving forward on open education. So the most obvious one to address is file format, which overall was done quite poorly among this sample of courses. An easy fix for this would be to provide all of the materials in editable formats as long as they're commonplace. So this would include things like docx, XLSX, PPTX, TXX, could be OpenDoc format. It doesn't really matter if it's proprietary or not, but as long as it's a commonplace format that could presumably be opened by a variety of tools. The second is language, and we think that language can be addressed by little things. So a full translation of a course into a multitude of language isn't actually necessary in many respects and is too much to ask for most educators. But things like a glossary, which explains all of the jargon and perhaps culturally specific terminology, could be very valuable in terms of helping guide other educators to use the sources. And lastly, in terms of materials, we feel that the use of open academic articles instead of paid textbooks or closed articles should be used where possible. So at the very minimum, using academic articles that are restricted by a publisher but are presumably available through a library would go a long way in making these courses more open.
This work leads to several potential avenues for future research. Of course, one obvious approach would be to do a broader comprehensive study using many more courses, and of course, looking at courses from other institutions beyond TU Delft and MIT. We could also further examine issues of harvestability and how courses can be best suited for delivery in low bandwidth environments. And of course, potential work could also look at how instructors locate and adapt OpenCourseWare for their own context.
And with that, we would like to thank you very much for attending this pre-recorded virtual presentation. Once again, my name is Eric Christiansen at Mount Royal University, and you can contact me via email or through my website.
And my name is Michael McNally, and I can be contacted via my university email. And again, thank you very much. And the final two slides, for which there's no narration, have the sources and courses examined.